Every minute in America, 20 people experience intimate partner violence. 1 to 2 people are trafficked globally. And about every 68 seconds, so basically every minute, someone is sexually assaulted. By the time I finish this monologue, all of that will have happened twice. That's not just alarming, that's a system running right on time. And what's fueling it? Technology. The same phone you use to binge watch your favorite docuseries or doom scroll through TikTok, it's also being used to stalk, groom, and control victims, all from a screen. But here's the twist. Tech is both the villain and the vigilante. Victims are using texts, DMs, screenshots, receipts to fight back. And if there's one thing Black folks know how to do, it is to show you the receipts. But let's rewind, because if tech is the new battlefield, then the war started long before Wi-Fi. When domestic violence and trafficking finally made it into the national conversation, it wasn't because Black women were speaking up. It was because white women were the ones seen in a Lifetime movie Escape or on a Nancy Grace special. Meanwhile, Black women were told, keep the family together, don't air dirty laundry, you better pray on it. And when they did speak up, they were labeled as angry, unstable, or just straight up ignored. But in the digital age, that silence is breaking loudly, because now Black women aren't just speaking up. They're going live, they're building platforms, they're coding apps, launching campaigns, and creating entire ecosystems of care online. That shift didn't just help women, it's helping everyone. Because when you build a system that only sees abuse through one narrow lens, white, female, fragile, you miss Black boys trafficked through gaming apps, queer men manipulated in encrypted chats, or fathers surveilled through smart home tech. Black communities aren't just surviving this digital evolution, that we're engineering the resistance. While laws like the Violence Against Women Act, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and the Take It Down Act are still playing catch-up, trying to fix a system that was never built for us in the first place. Black-led liberation groups have been doing the work in real time. And now the Department of Justice is talking about cutting funding for victims. So let's be clear, this isn't just about crime. It's about power, because Black communities have been living this for centuries. From slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration, the control of Black bodies has always been policy, not accident. So when we talk about surviving domestic violence and trafficking, we're not just talking about harm, we're talking about history. We're talking about systems. We're talking about stories that were never told until now. We know the problem. Now, let's get to the root of it. I'm Paris Alston, and this is Rooted. Right now on Rooted, we're unpacking how domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking are evolving in the digital age. Joining us is Shakira Robinson, survivor and advocate behind Shakira's story, Keith Maskell, founder of the Triggered Project, and Kenai Andrews, a frontline expert in trafficking prevention and survivor support. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So I want to focus on that word survivor, because each of you are survivors. And how do you think the language we use in terms of, like, you know, whether it is domestic violence or sexual assault or human trafficking, how does that shape who we see as survivors? Shakira, I'll start with you.
I think we're all surviving something. We're all navigating our ways through something that we've experienced. But in particular, when it comes to domestic and sexual abuse survivors, I think the term and the understanding of the whole issue has been, when it comes to Black and brown women in particular, I think there's a disparity between how we're identified and our white women counterparts are identified, especially when it comes to resources and access to certain care and things of that nature. There's a divide that happens.
And that's a great segue to Kenai, because I know that you work with this population. What does it look like for them?
It's a little complicated. Like if a teen is experiencing teen dating violence, it's frowned upon. It's like, well, that's not a real relationship. It doesn't matter because you're going to grow out of it. So they don't really have that support that an adult would have.
Now, Keith, how does this look different for men who I think, you know, so often we don't always see as survivors?
Yeah, I mean, I think the word survivor is something that even I've had to redefine for myself, right? What does that look like? Or that I'm surviving, but actually I'm not surviving anymore, I'm thriving.
That's right.
Right, and so as we look at redefining manhood, right, which is part of the conversation, I think we have to encourage people to redefine what survivor word means.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't like to use it, but especially men, having a really hard time with even admitting first that something has happened.
That's right.
Because of their own norms, but also the society has really started to shape, even technology-wise, this question of what does manhood look like? And that's where things get really, really tricky, because people just believe what they're seeing on social media. And even some of the other influencers, they're spreading some toxic masculinity that's happening. And one thing I've been noticing lately, and this is why we all have to do our work, is a lot of men, when we're talking, what is showing is the work that we haven't done yet.
Yes, and I think we're seeing that so prevalently in the manosphere, and even in some cases where older men are preying on young people, young boys in particular, by way of the internet.
Right.
We have seen an uptick in teen dating violence. Violence of teens against teens, sexual abuse on teens against teens or child against child. And when it comes to older men and black and brown boys, especially in the inner city, we have seen an uptick in those cases where they're either not believed, as we said, because they're not identifying as a victim, right? Like, something happened, but I'm not prescribing to that, right?
Yeah.
That's not my identity, or they disassociate. And when it comes to resources and services, we see that there's a plethora of resources and services for women and girls.
Right.
But when it comes to men, to Keith's point, is we have to navigate this through a different lens in terms of how we're supporting people. And so when we talk about manhood and what does toxic masculinity looks like, it varies from person to person.
Yeah, I think one thing that's also important is, which is even harder for us to talk about, is the women perpetrators at times, right?
Talk about it.
Women perpetrators to other women, but also to boys, because so many times, men don't realize that they've been abused.
That's right.
They have no idea that this experience that they had with an older woman was abuse.
And what are some of those indicators if people may not know if they were abused?
Yeah, I think, the older babysitter, right? Having a sexual experience with someone who is older is not okay. You get patted on the back because of that. That was that's more acceptable to have that happen. But I think it's just sometimes the basic interaction. I've talked about it before in saying that when I was in church, right? And I was a West Indian boy trying to get some sweet bread, but I had to go through different women who put my head in their breasts, right? Who would come and, oh, you're so sweet, and all this other stuff. And that was never talked about. And the other men in the church would laugh.
Yeah.
So Kanai, what are some of the other ways that technology is enabling some of this behavior or allowing people who may be victims to understand exactly what they're experiencing?
The comment section.
It always goes down in the comment section.
A comment section thread, or like it would be an innocent post and it'll either be demolished or upheld as something completely different, that it's just not what it is. And then the flip side of it is like the mental health side is like, what is the reality aside from the social media aspect? Before, it was just if a girl sends pictures to a dude, the worst thing that could happen is they get sent around, posted on social media, now she's the scandal of the week. Versus now it's like anything, and I mean anything, could be flipped, and then that's their new personality.
And you also have the issue of all the deep fakes, and I understand that people are using AI to deep fake porn now, and you can put anyone's face on the sexual act.
It can literally be, and this is why I don't do social media, solely because anything that you do on social media can be flipped into something else, and then the content that's on social media can then be posted on other platforms that you're no longer making money off of, but that's your face.
I'm curious, how has technology, or how has that enabled each of you, or to share what you've experienced?
A lot of men deal with financial abuse because they think, because I'm a man, I have to uphold this, and it's like, I don't agree. But that's a lot of conversations that happen there. And then also like just gaining perspective. I think that's an amazing thing that social media gives people, but it's what they do with that information as well.
Right. And Keith, you also have used technology both in virtual reality but also in the theater space to tell your story and to bring more survivors into the conversation.
Yeah, with creating Triggered Life with John Adewale Adekoje, telling my story is
shout out to John.
Oh my God. But being able to tell my story with the importance of helping other people, but getting other people just to kind of understand what happens for Black boys and Black men when we're activated. What happens, right? How can we see the humanity in us?
And Shakira, you've talked about this in your book, Shakira's story, because you do have children who have been affected by your experience.
When it comes to social media and how this all plays out and what is depicted from what we're trying to convey, whether we're survivors telling our stories to Keith's point, or we're working in the space and we're trying to empower someone who's trying to tell their story, I think we just have to continue to put this relevant and real information out there. But we have to also understand that it's either going to help someone or it's going to empower someone in their own private sector. So sometimes we think, I'm giving you the tools, now go do the thing. But sometimes justice is a slow process, right? And so even when it's for the individual trying to redefine themselves in front of a bunch of people who have witnessed them through a traumatic experience, we oftentimes are receiving inboxes from men in particular who are like, so I heard this was a safe space. I want to have a private conversation here first. Or they'll say, I'm reaching out anonymously on behalf of someone else, but it's really them, but they have to build trust first. And so there are some positive aspects when it comes to social media. For me in particular.
I'm glad you mentioned that because ultimately, there are policies and laws that govern the way that perpetrators of these crimes, the way that they can move. And I'm curious from each of you, and I'll start with you, Kenai, what's one policy or one action you'd like to see? I know that the Massachusetts State Attorney General, Andrea Joy Campbell, has filed a lawsuit against the Department of Justice because they're trying to rescind resources for communities that are helping crime survivors. But what else do you think the state can do to protect people?
So many things. Honestly, just like acting first. Like if someone comes to you and they say they're a survivor, you take that information. You don't just be like, okay, but like prove it. Like, or like more resources for just basic necessities. Because it's like a lot of the time, it's not even focused on the domestic violence. It's this is domestic violence, but with that, I'm now no longer have housing. So I have to figure out the housing piece. And the domestic violence is better anymore because it's gone. But in reality, it's still bothering them, and it's not depicting, but now controlling every single relationship after that because they haven't dealt with it. So the immediate needs is like basic necessities. So they can then process through everything else.
Keith, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I would love to see the state actually lift up the voices of real stories, because our real stories is what's gonna affect the change the most.
That's right.
Right? Come holler at us.
That's
you know what I mean?
That's
we got the art. We're bringing John. No, but like I think using art forces us to have conversations that are harder to have, and people will unite through stories and through art. And so I would like to see them take that initiative to hire artists, to hire folks like us and have us really have real conversations, but allow the art to lead it, right? And I don't think we've done anything like that.
And Shakira, lastly.
Man, great points. Absolutely great points. And I think what I'm going to say is going to piggyback off of both of them. Yes, we need more resources. Yes, we need the people who are on the front lines doing the work. But I think we need to leverage the playing field when it comes to these resources, when it comes to grants and opportunities for nonprofits to go after these grants. What is happening is when folks are applying for the same type of grant, first of all, the work of domestic violence, I'll just say it, is very siloed. And so when it comes to applying for grants and trying to get to the money to be able to do the work, to have this sustainable, effects in the community, we're all going after the same things, and now we're in competition with one another because no one wants to work as a collaborative, right? Everybody wants to be the one that has this saving piece. But if we collaborate, then we can see what those stories look like in terms of how we put these things together. So yes, we need resources, but we need to leverage the playing field when it comes to these statewide funding, because there are a lot of grassroots organizations and individuals who are doing the work, but they're not getting the recognition.
Well, this has been such an insightful conversation, and I'm hoping that it doesn't end here.
That's right.
Shakira, Keith, and Kanai, thank you all so very much for sharing your insights and your stories with us. And we have more Rooted ahead, so stay tuned. Right now on Rooted, we're looking at a growing national crisis, the federal government's failure to uphold protections for survivors of violence and trauma. Massachusetts Attorney General Andrea Joy Campbell is taking the Department of Justice to court, challenging illegal restrictions and funding rollbacks under the Violence Against Women Act and Victims of Crime Act. Attorney General Campbell, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So first, just lay it out. How did we get here?
We elected the wrong person. No, I will just take a step back. I've been stressing that the work we're doing to hold this federal administration accountable, including for services for victims of all types of crimes, it's not personal. It's accountability, and that's what we do, protecting our residents and all of the investments that come to Massachusetts to help folks, including victims. And frankly, what's at stake across the country is billions of dollars, and right here in Massachusetts, over $5 million for different purposes. And so we are holding them accountable by filing lawsuits. It's our most impactful tool, our litigation tool. And we have two in this VOCA, victim advocate, victim services space, with the goal of getting resources to Massachusetts folks who desperately need it.
Now, just a couple days after this multi-state lawsuit was filed, the Department of Justice did drop some of the conditions that it was imposing in terms of directing these funds to states that weren't complying with its immigration policies. But what exactly is the status right now?
So we have two lawsuits. Both are ongoing. One, we're waiting for a hearing date, but all positive, and I would say they're working. And so as you mentioned, one of the lawsuits we have, the DOJ has come to us and said we will release some of this funding, which is over $1 million, and let some of those conditions go, which is a positive. And so we're continuing to work at it with the hopes that they let all conditions go and that they allow us not only to disperse funds to organizations all across the Commonwealth and to victims directly, but also to make sure that anyone who is a victim of crime, regardless of their status, regardless of where they live in the state, that they get the services they're entitled to and that they need.
Are there, though, specific things that can make it harder to help victims of crime, such as domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking, who are also undocumented?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a posture from this administration that would suggest that all immigrants, for example, are criminals. That's nonsense. We know by data, by stories, immigrants here in Massachusetts are working sometimes 2 or 3 jobs, and they're also victims of crime. And frankly, regardless of what status you currently have, if you come to our great state and are harmed by someone, we should hold you accountable. Law enforcement also needs to continue to build trust, which they're doing, with folks in these various immigrant communities. Why? Because they report crime. So if someone is harmed by someone in our state, I would want them not only to be held accountable, but also for the person who was harmed and the victim of that crime to come forward so that no one else is harmed by the person who committed the act.
And help us understand, just beyond the personal story or the personal experience of someone who may be a victim of one of these crimes, what's the economic impact for the state if these funds don't come through?
I think it's twofold. One is if we just look at immigrant communities as a whole and just say focus on our Haitian population, right now under significant threat in so many different ways, and not only as victims, but also because of the rhetoric and policy of this administration. If you were to deport, for example, every single Haitian who is in Massachusetts, our elder care service, our PCA service for all of our folks who are within their homes that need care, that would be dismantled overnight. So the economic impact is significant. And then for the organizations that receive funding from all of these different various forms of legislation to have an impact, I brought numbers. So just in fiscal year 2025, we had over $4 million go to close to 1,000 claimants victims. And then, of course, nearly $17.6 million to over 95 victim service organizations, which leads to thousands more being helped and serviced by nonprofits that were already struggling. So it's meaningful impact for anyone who's ever been a victim of crime in this state. And of course, they get the services they so desperately need.
Now, earlier in the show, we talked to a number of survivors here at the Rooted Roundtable, including Shakira Robinson, Keith Maskell, and Kenai Andrews. And of course, Shakira and Kenai both work in the space where they're providing direct assistance to survivors. And they both talked about this crabs in the barrel mentality that we know exists in so many sectors in Massachusetts, especially when it comes to nonprofits, and how there's already a competition for the resources that are available. So how might that be worsened if these funds are rescinded or decreased?
So many folks are jealous of our state because we have such a robust nonprofit sector and philanthropic community. And what we saw is, yes, that mentality can exist, but I would actually say post-COVID, you have nonprofit leaders coming together even more to push back on that narrative and to hopefully work in collaboration and partnership. And they're certainly doing it now. They're recognizing that victims need services, right? And if anything, they're repurposing sometimes their mission to be able to provide greater services where funding may be more restricted. They are thinking outside the box and creating new sources of funding and being creative around that. They're sharing best practices. So what are you doing now in this moment in time, specifically in the immigration community or immigration context in migrant community to help our folks? And these ideas are helping and reaching more people. So actually, I give credit to nonprofit leaders during this moment in time, especially those with their own personal, powerful stories, who are stepping up in the face of pushback from a federal administration, working in collaboration with us, doing the work on the ground to reach more people.
What else do you think can be done on the policy end of this? Like, for instance, we know that men and immigrants, for instance, are vulnerable. Men are another population that we don't always think of as victims.
That's
are there
right.
things that we should be doing to specifically target these more vulnerable populations?
I would say, one, just our narrative. Men certainly are victims, and of course there are certain communities, whether it's poorer communities, communities of color, immigrants, who are most vulnerable to what we're talking about. And there are organizations and nonprofits on a regular basis, frankly, creating special initiatives and special programming for populations, including men, that require funding. And so my job is to fight for that funding, to make sure it continues to come to Massachusetts. And so far, our litigation and lawsuits are working. And then to get creative within our state to create more opportunities for funding, even through our own office, putting out a gun violence prevention grant, which the office had never done before, for $1 million through a public health model and lens to be able to reach more people and to have a greater impact with our organizations.
Now, we know that the state is coming off the heels of an emergency shelter crisis, where we had a huge influx of migrants, many of them Asian migrants, into the state, overloading our emergency shelter system. It sounds like, there have been some things done to even that out a little bit, but earlier this year, there were reports and concerns about crime that was happening within these emergency shelters. Do you think that the DOJ and the Trump administration could use this as fuel to their fire in wanting to rescind these funds?
I think they're using anything and everything, and much of it not based in fact, a lot of misinformation. And just the narrative around immigrants is painful to hear. To suggest that every immigrant is a criminal, when in many instances they are the victims of crime. And because they're most vulnerable to crime, there are people out there planning and plotting to scam them out of their money, including lawyers who are taking advantage of folks within our immigrant communities as they're trying to seek their status for asylum or TPS or something else. And we're seeing that, and we're holding those folks accountable. This is the time, frankly, to be more intentional about our resources and to have an impact. What I love about being in government is that government can be positive. It can have an impact. It can reduce cycles of violence and crime. And yet we don't have a federal partner looking to do that work with us, instead to demonize people. So we have an opportunity to shift that.
And so if you know that they are going to use that, how do you defend the state against that argument?
We get out there through every channel we can to lift up what is happening in our immigrant communities in particular, but most importantly, these nonprofit organizations that you mentioned that are doing incredible work, even in the hardest in most challenging times we've probably seen in this country in a really long time. They are still delivering services. They are still, even through MOVA at the state level, still meeting victims where they are, still bringing about trauma-informed care, still funding burial services, still making sure those who are surviving domestic violence and have the courage to come forward have access to housing, workforce development opportunities, and so much more. So if anything, I'm aligning with these organizational leaders to do the work and making sure through our litigation efforts, we're bringing them the resources they so desperately need and deserve.
Now, of course, when people are leaving the emergency shelters, the hope is that they can find housing, they can find jobs. But it's tough here in Massachusetts. And we know that a lack of housing, a lack of income are things that lead to people perpetrating things like domestic violence or falling into those abusive situations. So what else does the state need to do? And of course, I know you're the state's top criminal justice person, right? Not necessarily a policymaker, but what can be done on a holistic level to make sure that those things are in place so that people don't have to resort to crime to sustain a life here?
So while I may be the chief law enforcement officer for the state, I view my job as being bigger than just enforcing the law. So enforcing law currently tells me file those lawsuits and get our money for victims from the federal level and, of course, continue to push at the state level. But on the policy front, we also have a role to play there. I think it's redefining what public safety is. People often just view public safety as policing. But we add a public health lens to the work because, to your point, we can break cycles of violence if we are addressing poverty. Because why can't we imagine a community where you don't need police departments, where you don't need prisons, where everyone feels safe in their home, in their community, and in Massachusetts?
A big thanks to Massachusetts Attorney General Andrea Joy Campbell for joining us, and to our incredible guests, Keith Maskell, Shakira Robinson, and Kenai Andrews, for sharing their insights and lived experiences. Keep up with Rooted Online, subscribe to our newsletter, watch on YouTube, or listen on Spotify or wherever you get your podcast. Follow GBH News Rooted on social media and send your questions or story tips to us. Stay rooted, stay aware, and most importantly, stay tuned.